Okay, I'm back. So we have the Red Scare going on. A lot of Americans are afraid of what this new Communist Party means and how this is going to look and how it's going to affect the rest of the world. And they're also afraid that there might be people who would like to reform our government in a similar way. So the wartime propaganda, and along with the Red Scare, which is also being shown and propaganded, I guess. I don't know how to make that past tense. Or how to make that a verb. Is creating widespread xenophobia. Xenophobia is irrational feelings and suspicion of and fear of foreigners. Okay? Xenophobia starts with an X. I'm going to write it down for you. If I have some paper, I can write it on this one. Xenophobia. And there are still people today, sadly, who experience this. Xenophobia. So it's an irrational fear. That means that there's no reason to fear it. Some people just are. People are afraid of people who are foreigners. So people who are not American citizens, they're fearing. Okay, by mid-1920, when it became clear that the Bolshevik Revolution was not spreading beyond Russia, the Red Scare died down, but its legacy lived on through the 1920s. In particular, labor unions saw a sharp drop in membership because public opinion had turned against the unions, which many Americans now saw as Bolshevik, radical, and even un-American. A labor union is another thing that we're not going to really get into today. Basically, it is kind of a council they're supposed to look out for their workers. I'm not clear on all of the details on how that works. Some people think that they're amazing and some people don't agree with them. So yeah, that's something else I'll have to research a little bit. But a lot of people were kind of feeling like those unions were too communist-like. They felt like they were too radical and didn't feel comfortable being part of one. So those started to drop through the 1920s. All right. One other thing we're going to throw in that does not really have to do with the war, but it's going on at the same time around the entire world. And we can definitely relate to it because it was an epidemic, a pandemic like we're in right now. Okay, so widespread illness. But it was not the coronavirus. It was not the Black Plague. It was something super normal. It was the flu. The influenza epidemic. Now, of course, at that time, they didn't have all the vaccines for the flu and all the treatment options for the flu that we have today. Of course, the flu is a virus, so it doesn't have a cure or a very good treatment option. We just now know better ways to help keep our bodies healthy, help to prevent getting sick in the first place, and also we have a few medicines that can supposedly help shorten the amount of time that we're sick, or maybe how bad we are when we're sick. But remember, this is in the early 1900s, so they don't have as much technology and as many options as we have today. While World War I claimed many lives, as the war neared its end, a disease killed far more people than died in the war. Indeed, it killed more people than any other illness in recorded history. At least 50 million. Some estimates say up to 100 million. People lost their lives in an epidemic of influenza that swept the world from the fall of 1918 into 1919. In general, influenza most severely proved deadliest for young adults. Most severely affects children and the elderly, but this strain proved deadliest for young adults, like me. Estimates of deaths in the United States alone range from 500,000 to 675,000. In Europe, about as many American soldiers died of influenza as did in combat. So that's pretty interesting, and definitely something we can relate to today, and we can be thankful for the knowledge that we have of how to not spread so many germs, how to keep ourselves safe and healthy, and some of the vitamins and medicines that we have access to today. So take your vitamin C and keep your immune system up. Okay, so now we are getting to a close of World War I. Remember, by the time America joined, it had already been going on for 3 years. We joined in 1917. And so that's just about 2 years of us being involved, okay? Okay. By the fall of 1918, 2 million American troops were in Europe. Their presence broke the stalemate on the Western Front, enabling the combined armies of the Allies to drive the Germans out of France. America, said one German commander, became the decisive power in the war. Meanwhile, years of war and embargo had left the German people weary, impoverished, and hungry. Impoverished means very poor. Facing the prospect of a revolution, the Kaiser stepped down and the new German government called for a truce. And remember that Kaiser Wilhelm II, was also one of Queen Victoria's grandsons. On November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, 11/11/11, the guns along the Western Front finally fell silent. The war had exacted a terrible toll on the combatant nations. Approximately 2 million Germans lost their lives, as did 1.5 million men from Austria-Hungary, 1 million from the British Empire, 1.7 million from France, and 1.7 million from Russia. Because of the late entry of the United States into the war, casualties among Americans were comparatively light. Nevertheless, more than 50,000 American soldiers died in combat, more than would be killed decades later in the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about next time we do U.S. history, or when we do Asia. Okay, so 2 months after the truce, representatives of the Allied nations met at the Old Royal Palace in Versailles, France, with the purpose of negotiating a lasting peace. No representatives of the defeated Central Powers were invited to help shape the terms of the peace. Okay, so Wilhelm II steps down, new government takes over in Germany, and that new government says, okay, we're done. We've been fighting long enough. We can't take anymore. We're hungry. We're poor. Let's just get this over with. We lose. Okay? So people from the countries of the Allies, so people from Russia, people from the United States, people from France, and people from Great Britain get together in France at the palace in Versailles, and they say, okay, what are we going to do? Basically, what's going to be the consequences for this war, and how are we going to establish peace now? Some of the Allied leaders, especially the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, blamed Germany for starting the war and wanted to punish the Germans severely. But Woodrow Wilson, the head of the American delegation, proposed far more generous terms of peace. In January 1918, even before the war's end, President Wilson stood before Congress and set forth his idealistic program for a post-war world. Wilson's plan for peace, known as the 14 Points, called for justice, not revenge. He wanted the victors of the Great War to be generous toward defeated countries in order to prevent the bitterness that might provoke future wars. Under the 14 Points, Wilson stressed self-determination. He said the people of Poland, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, and many other lands should determine their own fate. Wilson hoped that self-determination would end the old imperialist system in which powerful industrial nations grabbed and ruled overseas colonies. So what Woodrow Wilson came up with, he's got 14 points, and he came up with this even before the truce. This is his idea for what he thinks would be best. He says that he doesn't think that these big industrialized nations should just be able to go and claim smaller countries or colonies. And like they were trying to do, remember, they were fighting over land again in the Balkan Peninsula when this all started. He thinks that they should be able to rule themselves in the way that they want. He thinks that instead of having a harsh punishment, that we should be just and fair, so that way the countries like Germany and Austria-Hungary won't want to seek revenge on us, and hopefully later, if we kind of reacted with grace and mercy, that it wouldn't spark that desire for revenge and potentially create another war in the future. The 14 points also included principles to help avoid tension between the nations. He called for an end to the secret treaties between countries. He urged freedom of the seas and removal of barriers to trade. He called for nations to reduce their stockpiles of arms and weapons. Finally, he proposed creating a new organization, a general association of all nations, to help keep peace. Wilson hoped that in this League of Nations, members would solve their differences by way of discussions and votes rather than through armed conflicts. So Wilson has the idea for a League of Nations where countries join, and it is where they can come and talk about their, kind of like a peace table. They can come talk about their problems with each other peacefully, maybe with some other people, kind of mediating and giving their opinions and helping them keep the peace instead of just jumping into war. Okay, so in the end, we have the Treaty of Versailles, and it did incorporate a lot of kind of a lot of severe punishments like they wanted in France for Germany, but it also included some of Wilson's 14 points, not all of them. It stripped Germany of its overseas colonies. So any land that Germany owned that was overseas, not on its mainland, they didn't have anymore. It incorporated a war guilt clause, blaming Germany alone for starting the conflict. Finally, it required that Germany pay the Allies reparations, or huge financial payments to cover the cost of the war. The treaty earned Wilson's approval because it called for respecting the rights of small nations and provided for the establishment of his League of Nations. But surprisingly enough, so the American president, Woodrow Wilson, had the idea for the League of Nations. And when he gets back to the U.S., remember, we have to all kind of agree on things the way that our government works. He wants this to be ratified by the Senate, but he had a hard time getting them on board with the Treaty of Versailles. Back home in America, Wilson urged the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. In an impassioned speech, he declared that the League of Nations was the only hope of mankind. Dare we reject it and break the heart of the world? But some prominent Americans attacked the treaty as an infringement on American sovereignty. Referring to Wilson, former President Theodore Roosevelt said he distrusted a man who loves other countries as much as his own. Senators in Roosevelt's Republican Party saw opposition to the treaty as a potent issue to use against Wilson, who was a Democrat. With the treaty stalled in the Senate, Wilson took his case to the people, embarking on a grueling cross-country speaking tour by train, giving as many as 4 speeches a day. The strain of this schedule brought on a stroke, which left the president partially paralyzed. He remained incapacitated until his death in 1924. Meanwhile, in 1920, the Versailles Treaty had gone down to defeat in the Senate. The United States never joined the League of Nations. So that's kind of interesting. The last thing we're going to talk about today is just kind of an interesting tidbit. So we learned that President Wilson suffered a stroke. They say that it's from all the stress of trying to get all these people on board with the League of Nations and on board with the Treaty of Versailles. So who steps in but his wife, Edith? Following her husband's stroke, Edith Wilson, the president's wife, stepped in to help run the government. The First Lady acted as the ailing president's liaison with the leaders of Congress and the cabinet. So that means basically she could go to meetings for him, she could speak for him, and she could help him do his job. She resisted efforts to transfer power to Vice President Thomas Marshall. Her actions led some to label her the secret president. In later years, Congress amended the Constitution to provide for a more orderly transfer of authority to the vice president when the president is, in the words of the amendment, unable to discharge the powers and duties in his office. So at the time, we didn't have that kind of clear cut saying if the president can't do it, then the vice president will step in. So Edith Wilson kind of stepped up and she said, no, we're not taking his power away. I will help him. I will be his liaison. And so after that, they kind of clarified that and to how that would work when something like this happens to the president. Okay, guys, so I will do some more personal safety videos for this week. Maybe we can get them knocked out before next week is over. See you soon. Bye.